so we had an election, huh? We had a very pivotal vote, didn't we? Election, rather, I should say. I'm not referring to the presidential election. I'm referring to the election, the vote in California. Proposition 8. Which, as you know, helped to overturn the unjust, illegal ruling that marriage could be redefined as between the same genders. So the people, once again, the will of the people once again overturned that. You know about that, right? Mm-hmm. Now, why would I say that that is more important, more significant than the presidential election? It was. Why would I say that? And by the way, the ramifications and the implications of what's going on there are humongous. They're huge.
Wasn't there also 2 other states that voted the same way?
Yes, yeah. California was the most prominent of it, and it was probably the one that would have the greatest influence across the whole country.
I understand they spent $70 million.
Mm-hmm. Half that money came from the Mormons, who are now being persecuted for it.
And a lot of the money came from one gay activist billionaire on the pro-gay marriage side.
Yeah. Really? Do you know who that was?
Tim Gill, his name is.
Tim Gill?
Tim Gill. He puts money in all the different state battles. He just pours money in. So.
Yeah, it's quite a. I did a whole program on it. You'll on my program, Body of Truth, on Catholic Radio International. That should be up next week. You'll hear an interview with Bishop Cordinioni from San Diego, who is at the epicenter of this battle in California. Very fascinating stuff, what's really going on and what the implications are. And the reason I bring it up to begin with is that, and the reason why I say that it was the more significant election, or vote.
Just because of the way the vote came through? And who voted? If you're going to look at it from let's play with the figures, I guess from the Catholic vote. Because here was something that I had observed. 54% of the Catholic vote voted for Obama in this election. Mm-hmm. Whereas on the Proposition 8, a huge number came out and they said it was supported by Protestants, evangelical Protestants, and the Mormons, like you say. And then also the Catholic vote came out very high for their Proposition 8, which was sort of a dichotomy that had occurred.
Yes.
That I thought was interesting, but I had not been able to take it much further than that.
Yeah. Well, the reason why it's significant because
What we're studying.
it's all about this, yeah. It's about what is the DNA of the created order, the spousal mystery. Who is man for woman, who is woman for man. You get that right, you get everything right. Doesn't matter about your economic policies. All those things will be influenced by this one thing. That's the whole message of the theology of the body, the spousal mystery. And if we do not understand that, if we mess that up, we mess the world up. The world. Every policy, global, environment, economic, you name it, will be positively or negatively influenced by our view of the human person. If I had one question that I would ask of the candidates, it would be this. And you'd watch them squirm. You'd watch their brains go on a complete nuclear meltdown. You'd watch them babble. But I would ask the candidate, as you should, what is your view of the human person? Just picture them trying to answer that. But that's the only question that matters. What is your view of the human person? Because from that will come the best health care, the best economic policy, the best global policy, best environmental policy, world peace, right? From that will come the best in those other areas. And that was John Paul II's whole point. He knew that that's where we were going wrong, and if we could correct that, you could correct everything. So that's why California was so pivotal. And if California would go, the whole nation probably would go. And you're right, getting into some of the details of it was fascinating, just to, as a way of introducing tonight. The evangelicals called their people to fasting for 40 days. Fasting and prayer. I mean, serious fasting. They had people from around the country, young people, living on soup for 40 days and praying. And they told their people to confess their sins to another Christian. Can you imagine? Evangelicals.
This is in California?
California, yeah. Yeah. They outdid the Catholics on this one, but it was a great effort though. It shows you what cooperation. It was a joint effort. They finally pulled it together, and through prayer and fasting and cooperation between Christians, they were able to do it. Kind of a microcosm of the power that is there, the sleeping giant that is there. And they, evangelicals, spoke in terms of a sacramental view of marriage. So that's what united these groups. They had a sacramental view of marriage, even though they weren't all Catholic. And that kind of begins what we're going to talk about tonight, and that is this word ethos. Ethos. The beginning of this section here, of the top, and it's on page 264. It's number 3. It's called Commandment and Ethos. Ethos, the difference between commandment and ethos is very significant. And again, this is what the point of this is. This is what John Paul II was trying to deliver. That ethos is your interior disposition morally, not the laws, the commandments. Those things are there, they're helps, but they are not what, and it's what the Old Testament relied on largely. And his whole point in what we're going to be looking at tonight is that when Christ comes along, he moves it from the law to the ethos, to the interior of us, interior person, the interior worldview, from the heart. The heart means the seedbed of our interior worldview. And out of that is what we are to live the commandments, or the laws, or the rules, as it were. The goal really is to not need rules, not to need laws, but to do what is right out of this interior disposition, this ethos. See, so ethos is sort of like the context for the ethics. Ethics grows out of an ethos. And that's why, going back to what I said before, I would ask the politicians just one thing: what is your worldview of the human person? In other words, what is your ethos? Because that will govern all your other policies. Without an ethos, your policies are worthless. No matter who you are, Democrat, Republican, or whatever. So, okay, let's look at then, because he's, you notice it says Christ appeals. We're in a section called Christ appeals to the human heart, which is part of this whole era of the historical man. Remember, we have three. If you want to think of Theology, to sum it up, the best way is there's 3 aspects of the anthropology: original man, how things were at the beginning; historical, what happened after the fall, and historical is what we're living in. That's why I call it the historical man. And then eschatological. Where do we go from here? What is our destiny? What happens is Christ comes into this era to redeem it and to point it to this era. In other words, Christ comes in to redeem us and then to show us the way. Okay, that's the anthropology. Then his other three then, so it's two sets of three. The other three is basically about celibacy, virginity, marriage, and then love and fruitfulness, which is basically this right here, love and fruitfulness. This is really the reason he compiled his Theology of the Body. Love and fruitfulness is the explanation of the total vision of the human person as applied to the church's teaching on contraception. It took all of this to make that teaching make sense. Because remember, in Humana Vitae, Paul VI said that it would only be understood if we could have a total vision of man, the human person. Total vision. And this is what John Paul II was trying to present. The total vision of the human person. Because only with that, again, the ethos, only if you understand the big picture can you understand the specifics. And in fact, when you understand the big picture, you automatically will accept the specifics. Unless you're just hard-hearted. But the reason we don't accept the specifics, we have trouble with the specifics, such as the teaching on contraception, because we don't understand the total vision. And Paul VI knew this. And John Paul came along to fill in that total vision. So, but it took all of this. It first explained who we are as a human person, and then how we live it. So this is who we are, how we live it. Or I like to say, the why behind being human, man and woman, and therefore the how-to. And this is what enables us to understand the entire ethos of Catholicism and its ethics, its teachings. And once that's understood, you understand everything. When we don't understand or accept church teaching on something, there's only one reason why, other than the hard-heartedness, and that is we don't understand, or not aware, knowledgeable of the ethos, the worldview, the view of the human person. The world has a different view of the human person. That's why the world doesn't understand the church's teaching. It's like railroad tracks. It's two parallel things that will never meet. They can never, ever meet. And that's why the world does not understand the church. It continually, beats on the church and criticizes because it doesn't understand why the church doesn't change. It can't change any more than two railroad tracks can suddenly cross each other. Two parallel tracks. Okay, so he's going to deal with then this from Matthew chapter 5. We have been dealing with it with whoever looks at a woman, how to look at someone. He's dealing with lust and the purity of heart. Let's look on page 265. About the fifth line down on the top. The Sermon on the Mount, and in particular the passage we have chosen as the center of our analysis, is part of the proclamation of the new ethos, the ethos of the gospel. In the teaching of Christ, it is deeply connected with consciousness of the beginning, and thus with the mystery of creation in its original simplicity and wealth. At the same time, the ethos that Christ proclaims in the Sermon on the Mount is realistically addressed to a historical man who has become the man of concupiscence. The threefold concupiscence is in fact the heritage of all humanity, and the human heart really participates in it. Christ, who knows what is in man, cannot speak otherwise than with this awareness. From this point of view, what predominates in the words of Matthew 5:27-28 is not accusation, but judgment, a realistic judgment about the human heart, a judgment that has, on the one hand, an anthropological foundation, on the other hand, a directly ethical character. For the ethos of the gospel, it is constitutive judgment. Okay, so he's introducing this idea that Christ is introducing now an ethos. And to do so, he's going to show you that Jesus Christ is basically going to say that what's in the Old Testament, which a lot of people use to justify things like, as you'll see, polygamy, because it's in the Bible, Jesus Christ will say that what is in the Bible at that time was not what was in the beginning. He's going to take us back to the beginning, to how it was supposed to be, and what we're called to do, what the call of Theology Body is to reach back into that beginning and try to retrieve some of that. Although we cannot, as John Paul II very explicitly said, you cannot retrieve it entirely, so it's basically lost forever.
Okay.
But you can enter back there to an extent. So we reach back, but then we also reach forward into eschatological man, into what Christ has ushered in. In other words, how he's come into this whole picture and said, yeah, retrieve some of the old, but I'm going to show you the new, the ultimate. Maybe ultimate be the better word. I'm going to show you the ultimate, which is even beyond the new, or the old, even beyond the old, the original. Okay.
Christ is doing this?
Christ is, yes.
And you're going to show us how, right?
Yes, that's how he, in his answer to the Pharisees. See, let's read that. John, he spends so much time on that in the Theology of the Body. Let's read that passage. This is chapter 5:27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This, I remember, I'll never forget that, standing in St. Peter's Square, a young seminary, and actually hearing these words from the Pope saying that even if a husband looks at his own wife lustfully, he commits adultery in his heart. I'll never forget when I heard those words. I heard those words from his lips in person. And I felt the world shift on its axis. I thought, this is it. This is what I gave him too much credit. I thought this is what every feminist is waiting to hear from the church. This will just... And I remember when I returned to the United States from Rome, I was actually specifically looking for how this was being received in America. Naive I was. I was so excited. And then I was terribly disappointed when I heard that the way it was being received was, now do you hear that crusty celibate priest in Rome saying I can't even have attraction to my wife? No, it's not what he was saying. Which shows you how confused we were about what lust is and what attraction is. What is legitimate and what is not legitimate. So,
Excuse me, but when they say adultery, why not like fornication? Why, is it because pretty much everybody was married back then, or? So it could, because it's not necessarily a married woman or a married man, it could be a single man looking at a single woman.
mhm.
So why the term adultery, or is it just a translation quirk, or?
You mean like why?
Like it says he has committed adultery with
Mhm.
her, but that would assume that he was married or she was
Oh,
married, at least one of them
yes.
was married. But it applies to singles too, you know? So I'm
Yes.
just wondering, I always wondered why the term adultery didn't seem to quite fit there.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see in the, I think the answer to your question is in the text today. So let's look at it. This will be, let's start on page, we'll get to that, the answer to your question, but we'll start to look at a couple of quotes before that. On page 266, this is in section number 4. Because Christ appeals precisely to the human heart, which cannot be the subject of any generalization, with the category of, this is part in italics, number 4, with the category of heart, everyone is identified in a singular manner, even more than by name. He is reached in that which determines him in a unique and unrepeatable way. He is defined as humanity from within. Okay, so there's the idea that the heart is our interior disposition, and that's the thing that's important. This was part of the shift that Christ was bringing into this whole ethos. He was taking it out of the external observance and moving it into the heart, into the interior of the person. Okay, let's look at number 5. The image of the man of concupiscence concerns above all his innermost being. The history of the human heart after original sin is written under the pressure of the threefold concupiscence, with which also the deepest image of the ethos is connected in its various historical documents. At any rate, that innermost being is also the strength that is decisive for external human behavior as well as for the form of the many structures and institutions on the level of social life. If we deduce the content of ethos in its various historical formulations from these structures and institutions, we always encounter this innermost aspect proper to man's inner image. This image is in fact the most essential component. The words of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, especially those of Matthew 5:27-28, indicate this fact unmistakably. No study on human ethos can pass by this fact with indifference. In other words, translated, the view of the human person. The view of the human person will determine your ethos, and from that, the ethics. All right, let's go to now, there's a big section here on page 268. He's going to explain this, we're going to answer Sister's question. We're going to start it, I'm going to start it, I think we need to start it just before that. Let's actually start on 35, on page 267, section 35, the history of the people. What he's going to do is John Paul II is going to take the prescription of thou shalt not commit adultery. He's going to put it in the context of the Old Testament, of the people, the culture, and so on. Because this is what Christ knew he was addressing. Okay, we must carry out the analysis of Christ's statement in the Sermon on the Mount that refers to adultery and to lustful desire, which he calls adultery committed in the heart. So he's kind of equating the two. By beginning with the first words, Christ says, "You've heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery." He has in mind the commandment of God, the sixth in the Decalogue. It is part of the so-called second tablet law which Moses received from God Yahweh. Let us first take the point of view of the direct listeners of the Sermon on the Mount, of those who heard Christ's words. They are sons and daughters of the chosen people, the people who had received the law from God Yahweh himself, that had received also the prophets, who had repeatedly in the course of centuries reproached precisely the people's relation to this law, the many transgressions of the law. Christ, too, speaks about similar transgressions, but even more so, he speaks about a human interpretation of the law that cancels and does away with the right meaning of good and evil, specifically willed by the divine legislator. The law is, in fact, above all, a means, an indispensable means, in order that justice may superabound. Christ wants such justice to exceed, literally, abound more than that of the scribes and Pharisees. He does not accept interpretation they had given the course of the centuries to the authentic content of the law. Inasmuch as they in some measure subjected this content, or the purpose or will of the legislator, to the various forms of weakness and limits of the human will that derive precisely from the threefold concupiscence. In other words, what he's saying is that the law, as we read it in the Old Testament, that talked about thou shalt not commit adultery, yet allowed polygamy, that law was, or that practice was superimposed on the original meaning of the law because of human weakness, because of the culture, and something in particular about the culture, which we'll get to. It was a casuistic interpretation that had superimposed itself on the original vision of good and evil connected with the law of the Decalogue. If Christ strives for a transformation of ethos, he does so above all to recover the fundamental clarity of interpretation. Let's go to number 2. If one follows the history of the chosen people, the page of the Old Testament from the time of Abraham, one finds abundant facts that attest to how this commandment was put into practice, and how, as a consequence of this practice, the casuistic interpretation of the law was worked out. First of all, the history of the Old Testament is clearly the theory of the systematic defection from monogamy, which must have had a fundamental significance for the understanding of the prohibition, you should not commit adultery. The abandonment of monogamy, especially at the time of the patriarchs, was dictated by the desire for offspring, for numerous offspring. See? They compromised the law because of a desire for offspring. That's what they put as the most important. This desire was so deep, and procreation as the essential end of marriage was so evident, that wives who loved their husbands, when they were unable to give them offspring on their own initiative, asked their husbands who loved them if they could take on their own knees or receive children born of another woman. Exactly. And even Rachel and Jacob, Genesis 30. These two narratives reflect the moral climate in which the Decalogue was practiced. They illustrate the way in which the Israelite ethos was prepared to receive the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, and how this commandment was applied in the most ancient tradition of the people. The authority of patriarchs was in fact the highest in Israel and had a religious character. It was strictly tied to the covenant and the promise. The commandment, you shall not commit adultery, did not change this tradition. Everything indicates that its further development did not limit itself to the rather exceptional motives that had guided the behavior of Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and Rachel. If we take as example the most illustrious representatives of Israel after Moses, namely the kings of Israel, David and Solomon, the description of their lives attests that effective polygamy established itself, and it did so undoubtedly for reasons of concupiscence. In the story of David, who had also several wives, what is striking is not only the fact that he had taken the wife of one of his subjects, but also the clear consciousness of having committed adultery. This fact, as well as the king's repentance, are described in a detailed and suggestive way. 2 Samuel. Now here's one of the key points. By adultery, one understood only the possession of another's wife, but not the possession of other women as wives next to the first one. See, so this is what they're... Yeah. Adultery is understood as only the possession of another's wife, but not the possession of other women as wives next to the first one. The whole tradition of the Old Covenant indicates that the effective necessity of monogamy as an essential and indispensable implication of the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, never reached the consciousness and ethos of the later generations of the chosen people. Okay, we're down to number 4, down a few sentences. If one considers the letter of this legislation, it becomes evident that it combats adultery decisively and without hesitation, using radical means, including the death penalty. Yet, it does so while actually supporting effective polygamy, fully legalizing it, at least in an indirect way. Interesting, huh? Adultery is thus combated only within definite limits and within the circumference of definite premises that make up the essential form of the Old Testament ethos. In these laws, adultery is understood above all, and perhaps exclusively, as the violation of the man's property right regarding every woman who was his legal wife, usually one among many. Adultery is not understood by contrast as it appears from the point of view of the monogamy established by the Creator. You see? The Old Testament laws were already different than what was intended by the Creator in the beginning. Yes?
One quick question. Back at the end of 2, when he's talking about, when Sarah is barren, and then so she asks Abraham to sleep with Hagar, so that they can have a son. It says that was sort of a concession to his, to their weakness, that that they wanted to have children so badly that they sort of violated the way that it was supposed to be. I need to read that story again, but didn't God kind of give him permission to do that, like Abraham to sleep with Hagar, or was that just Sarah that said, "Oh, go ahead and do it because we really need kids"?
It's mostly Sarah,
Okay.
and as he's saying here, that principle, that desire was so strong, that was so important to them that they, in a sense, they superimposed a kind of interpretation of God's will over the law, so that would allow them to do this. So it became a norm in the time of the patriarchs. So it was kind of it was like, well, God understands we can do this because we have to have this project. So it was like that.
So it's an example of their will as opposed to thy will be done.
Yeah, not so much opposed. It wouldn't be so much opposed in their mind. Direct opposed was, and I think the Pope uses a great term. It's superimposing something over it, over God's will, not necessarily negating it, but superimposing. Kind of like.
Where does he say that? Sorry.
It's at the top of 268. It was a casuistic interpretation that had superimposed itself on the original vision of good and evil connected with the law of the Decalogue. So there was an original vision, an original intention.
The Decalogue came after that, though, didn't it?
Yeah.
Chronologically.
Yeah. Well, okay. There was the original plan of man.
Right.
The two should become one.
Original man.
Original man, right. And the Decalogue was supposed to kind of ratify that, be an extension of that. But they superimposed this allowance over the Decalogue, is what he's saying. In other words, it says do not commit adultery, but we need progeny.
Right.
See, so you get it however you can get it. Yes.
I think I understand it too, in that it's the spousal meaning of the body. So if we're all spouses, whether we're single or not, our bodies have a spousal meaning. When we do something that's outside of that, it's adultery.
Right.
So in a sense, all sexual sin is like adultery.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that's why he's going to say that if a man looks at his own wife lustfully, it's adultery. Commits adultery in his heart. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's one of two. Where were we? Oh. Oh yeah, number 4. on page 269, the second paragraph under number 4. In these laws, adultery is understood above all, and perhaps exclusively, as the violation of the man's property right regarding every woman who was his legal wife, usually one among many. Adultery is not understood by contrast as it appears from the point of view of the monogamy established by the Creator. We know already that Christ appealed to the beginning precisely concerning this matter. Okay, number 5. Very significant in addition is the situation in which Christ takes the side of the woman caught in adultery and defends her from stoning. He says to the accusers, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." When they drop the stones and go away, he says to the woman, "Go, and from now on do not sin again." Christ, therefore, clearly identifies adultery as sin. By contrast, when he turns to the ones who wanted to stone the adulteress, he does not appeal to the prescriptions of Israelite law, but only to conscience. The discernment of good and evil inscribed in human conscience can turn out to be deeper and more correct than the content of a legal norm. Now, very significant. It means that the spousal mystery, which John Paul II says is fundamental to human existence, is in fact written on the human heart, regardless of what laws say or don't say. In other words, he says that these guys knew in their conscience, from their conscience, that they were not clean. They were not perfect. Which means Christ is appealing to their conscience, to their interior ethos, not the law. In other words, these guys could have responded, "Oh, well, I didn't steal anybody's wife, so I didn't commit adultery." But they didn't. They turned away, knowing they were not without, that they were not without sin. And what sin was that? Then the sin would have been lust on their part, which they knew. It's not specified in the law. The law specifically says adultery, and as John Paul said earlier, they saw adultery basically as property, as taking another man's property, his wife. And these Pharisees, these guys would have known that. They would have lived by that. So why did they defend themselves and say, "We didn't take anybody's property"? But they didn't. They didn't respond because they knew they were guilty. They knew from their conscience, not from the law. Do you understand?
Yeah, but they also had formed consciences too.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have worked.
Formed consciences, or just in their human heart, just in their heart, they knew. This is why one of the reasons why when you really learn, people really hear this theology of the body, it does touch us in an area that's universal to all of us. It touches us in our hearts because it's written on our hearts. It's the truth about being human. In other words, we are hardwired. In fact, I just did on my program last week, there was an article about how men are genetically hardwired for monogamy. Believe it or not. Men are genetically hardwired for monogamy. So for men to be faithful, to seek out a partner for life, and to remain faithful to that partner is actually consistent with the hardwiring of males. It has to do had to do with the gene and a hormone called vasopressin. So it is inescapable. We know, even though we put layers of, when we try to kill our conscience, when we act wrongly, still we are wired for, deep inside of us, it is written on our hearts, we're hardwired, even our brain chemistry is hardwired for commitment to one person, for monogamy, because that's the spouse, that's why he said the spouse, it's one of my favorite sayings, and The spousal mystery is the fundamental element of human existence. We're wired for it. We cannot escape it. Well, I mean, we go against it, kind of like it's like in a contrived way. You know, we're sort of like stripping our gears in a sense, or stripping our anthropological gears by not living according to it. But it's not how we're wired. See, the key about the theology of the body is John Paul II is like lifting a veil and allowing us to look into the human person and to see the human person as we really, really are. You know, past all this BS and all the theories and all the psychobabble and sociology and evolution, all the stuff that has been layers of veils that have been put over us for centuries now, especially since the 16th century, as this introduction by Dr. Waldstein so brilliantly articulates. And he's peeling back all those layers, saying, no, this is the truth of the human person. And the truth of it is that it's the spousal mystery. We are literally, it's written on our hearts, we're literally hardwired, even by our physiology, for union and communion with another. Faithful, free, fruitful, 4 F's. Full, fruitful, free, and faithful. Yes.
Why, like, if that spousal mystery is something that is sort of written on our hearts, you know, that each person can know, regardless of sort of their cultural or religious upbringing or whatever, why do we have such a hard time realizing that today? Like, you know, what we started all talking about, Proposition 8 in California and things. There seems to be this tension between we're sort of fundamentally good at heart, but we need laws to sort of keep us in line, because despite being good, you know, we want to do all these bad things. So
Right.
like you mentioned, that the ideal is to not need the law.
Right.
And it seems to me that people that want to advocate for, you know, all sorts of different forms of marriage, abortion on demand, you know, they sort of wanted to jump ahead to that point where, you know, there are no restrictions, like you can't tell
Right.
me what to do, you know, you can't dictate the way that I live. But we're not ready to live at that point because we're still so drawn towards like sin or like rebellion. I mean, like, I guess, why is it so difficult for people to sort of get into their hearts, so to speak? You know?
Very good. It's because because as he's saying in this whole section, we now have the man, he calls it the man of concupiscence. In other words, our hearts have been hurt and damaged, you know, wounded. So we have this tendency, we have to fight against this tendency that is now, it was never a part of us originally, but it's there now. It's like, you know, something that's been, you know, like a computer virus. You know, it got into us, and just like a computer virus, it's now affecting the whole system. Even though the computer is good, starting out as good, the normal way for computer work is to work well. But now the virus is in there, so it cannot work well. And if we want to look at the sort of the dynamics of this thing, it has to do with, again, everything's a repeat original sin, of that autonomy. We want autonomy. We want to be able to do what we want without answering to an authority. So, let's take the issue of, your question is very good. Let's take an issue of the same-sex attraction, okay? Same-sex attraction is not something written on our hearts. That's why we call it disorder. In other words, it's out of the order. So a person has this or feels this. They think they do. They can look at that through this spirituality, this lens, and come up with a much more redemptive view of that about themselves, which will require on their part a choice to die to self and to defer to a higher authority. Okay, they can do that, or they can choose the path that negates that authority and just is going to do what we want. I'm simply going to respond out of this feeling that I have. And I won't anyone to tell me I can't. It's the easier choice. It's the most immediate one. But it's one that it's rooted basically in that rebellion. You know, that rather than look at this and look at it through the eyes, the lens of this, they'd rather, chuck that and just say, I'm just gonna, I want, whatever I feel is what I want. And no authority is gonna tell me no. In fact, what's happening now is the Mormons, and especially now, but others, are now being persecuted by those who wanted to, wanted to have same-sex marriage legalized.
They're suing.
Hmm?
Aren't they suing? I thought there was a court case, right?
Yeah, they're
They're going after the way which they persecute down Sage by legal means that affect their pocketbook.
they're trying to, but legal means they're also on blogs and stuff threatening burning churches.
They protest outside their churches.
Yeah,
with
the
signs
protests
and screens.
outside.
There's this huge, scary
Yeah.
march in Long Beach.
Yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds of people marching through the streets, like raging,
Yeah.
like, you know what, we had a vote. You didn't
Yeah.
win.
Right.
Go home.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, this is the way this country works.
Right, we had 3. There were 3. This whole thing was unnecessary. Twice the people of California voted, against same-sex marriage, but it was judges once again outstepped their bounds. And then fortunately, our Constitution allows for the amendment, so that's how they did it. We were able to overcome the judges, but you see the reaction then is what? The reaction is rage, anger, vindictiveness, hate. What does that tell you? What is it the fruit of? What does it indicate? It indicates this autonomy. I want what I want, you don't want to give it to me, so I'm going to strike at you. And it's just a repeat of original sin. Adam and Eve, God told Adam and Eve, you can have this, but you can't have that. And basically the devil convinced them to say, you're not going to tell me that, I'm going to take, if I want that, I'm going to take it. So it's that autonomy is the key word. We want autonomy. We want to be autonomous. We basically want to be God. We want to be our own God.
So history repeats.
Yeah, it just continues to repeat. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, this is why John Paul went back to the beginning. Back to the beginning. It's all there. It's just unpacking the Garden of Eden. Okay, let's see now. It's interesting now development about on this. So let's go. Let's see. Okay, next paragraph. On the top of page 270, the next paragraph. As we have seen, the history of the people of God in the Old Covenant, which we try to illustrate only with a few examples, unfolded to a remarkable degree outside the normative content placed by God in the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery." It bypasses, so to speak. Christ wants to correct this distortions. Hence the words spoken by him in the Sermon on the Mount. Imagine, Christ is correcting the Bible. which is why you just can't quote Bible verses to justify everything. Because a lot of people do. A lot of well-meaning people think, I've heard that recently, I see another little fad popping up that, oh, Bible, polygamy is okay, it's in the Bible, that Abraham did it. Okay, down at the bottom of 270, the last paragraph. The prescriptions of the Old Testament law were very severe. They were also very specific and entered into the smallest concrete details of life. It's got a whole bunch of references there. One can presume that as the legalization of effective polygamy became evident in the law, there was an increased need for fixing its juridical extent and securing its legal limits. Hence, the great number of prescriptions and also the severity of the punishments laid down by the lawgiver for breaking such norms. In other words, they knew this was a superimposing that they did. And they knew that it had some limits on it. Okay, on the basis of the above analysis of Christ's appeal at the beginning in his discourse on the dissolubility of marriage and the certificate of divorce, it is evident that he clearly sees the fundamental contradiction contained in the marriage law of the Old Testament, inasmuch as it accepted effective polygamy, that is, the institution of concubines in addition to legitimate wives, or the right of cohabitation with a slave woman. One can say that this law, while combating sin, at the same time contained in itself the social structures of sin. In fact, it protected and legalized them. Ooh, sound kind of contemporary? In these circumstances, the essential ethical meaning of the commandment, do not commit adultery, necessarily suffered a fundamental revaluation. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ reveals this meaning again and thus passes beyond its traditional and legal restrictions. Wow. It is perhaps useful to add that in the interpretation of the Old Testament, while the prohibition of adultery is marked, one might say, by a compromise with the concupiscence of the body, the opposition to sexual deviation is clearly defined. The relevant prescriptions, which impose capital punishment for homosexuality and bestiality, confirm this opposition. As for the behavior of Onan, son of Judah, whose name is the origin of the modern term onanism, sacred scripture says that what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So what he's saying is that even though the adultery thing was compromised because of that one hang-up they had on progeny, other sexual deviations were not. They were very strict and severe about them. Taken in its entirety, the marriage law of the Old Testament places the procreative end of marriage in the foreground. I want you to look at a footnote at the very bottom of the page, the last sentence. In the Old Testament, there is no explicit mention of the obligation to monogamy, though the image presented by the later books show that it was the prevalent social practice. A little footnote there. Okay, taking in its entirety, the marriage law of the Old Testament places the procreative end of marriage in the foreground. In some cases, it tries to implement the equality of women and men before the law. For example, it explicitly says about the punishment for adultery. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. But on the whole, it judges the woman differently and treats her with greater severity. Now, okay, we're number 3. One should perhaps draw, this is on page 272, one should perhaps draw attention to the language of this legislation, which is, as always in such cases, an objectifying language of the sexology of that time period. It is also an important language for the whole, the reflections of the theology of the body. We find in it the explicit confirmation of the character of shame that surrounds
what in man belongs to sex. The sexual is even considered in some sense impure, especially in the case of physiological manifestations of human sexuality. Uncovering nakedness, for instance, is stigmatized as the equivalent of performing a complete illicit sexual act. The very phrase seems expressive enough. There is no doubt that the lawgiver sought to use a terminology corresponding to the consciousness and practice of society at the time. In this way, the language of Old Testament legislation should convince us that not only that the physiology and the body manifestation of sex are known to the lawgiver, but also that they are evaluated in a definite way. It is difficult to avoid this impression this evaluation has a negative character. This certainly does not cancel the truth we know from Genesis, nor can one accuse the Old Testament, and among others, also the legislative books, of being a sort of precursor of Manichaeanism. Now, you know what Manichaeanism is, right? The judgment about the body and sex expressed in it is not primarily negative or even severe, but rather marked by an objectivism motivated by the intention of setting this area of human life in order. It is not concerned directly with the order of the heart, but the order of social life as a whole, at the basis of which stands, as always, marriage and the family. Okay, you understand what he's saying? He's saying that these laws were, the point of them was not to say, he's cautioning, and don't think the Bible was saying that the body is bad, the sexuality is bad, even though they have these severe laws. These, what they were about, what their goal was, the right ordering of a society. They were all about what was good for the society, for the community. And especially, he says, as regards marriage and family. So that's what these laws were for. They were not, even though they seemed to be negative at first in some areas of the body and sexuality, that wasn't their intent. Their intent was what is good. It's just like the dietary laws, very much like the dietary laws. Why do they have all these dietary laws and laws about cleanliness and all that? Well, it's not because so many things of nature were bad or dirty, but because they believed that this was protecting the society at the time, you know, from diseases or whatever, you know. Okay, now there's an interesting point he brings in about the prophets. The prophets have a little different spin. We're going to look on page 273, about halfway down the first paragraph, halfway down number 5. It is the tradition of the prophets. When they referred to adultery, they wanted to remind Israel and Judah that their greatest sin was in abandoning the one true God in favor of the cult of various idols that had been adopted easily and thoughtlessly by the chosen people, in contact with other peoples. In this way, what is characteristic of the language of the prophets is the analogy with adultery rather than adultery itself. Yet such an analogy also helps one to understand the commandment, "You should not commit adultery," and its interpretation, which is noted as absent in legal text. In the revelations of the prophets, particularly Isaiah, Hosea, and Ezekiel, the God of the covenant, Yahweh, is often represented as bridegroom, and the love with which he joined himself to Israel can and should be equated with the spousal love of a people. Because of its idolatry and desertion of God, the bridegroom, Israel commits a betrayal before him that can be compared to that of a woman in relation to her husband. It commits, in fact, adultery. So let's skip over to 276, number 4. 276. Leaving aside this detail, it is impossible to overlook that the text of the prophets reveal a different meaning of adultery than the legislative tradition gives it. Adultery is sin because it is the breaking of the personal covenant between the man and the woman. It's not just because it's breaking a law about property and ordering of society, but it's about breaking a personal covenant between man and woman. See, the prophets now start to, as Emeril Lagasse would say, kick it up a notch. Kind of towards what Christ is going to bring in. What is emphasized in the legislative text is the violation of property rights, in the first place of the husband's property right to the woman, who, though she is his legal wife, is one among many. In the text of the prophets, the background of effective and legalized polygamy does not change the ethical meaning of adultery. In many texts, monogamy seems to be the only right analogy of monotheism, understood in the categories of the covenant, that is, of faithfulness and trust in the only true God Yahweh, Israel's bridegroom. Adultery is the antithesis of this spousal relation and the opposite of marriage, also as an institution. Inasmuch as monogamous marriage actualizes in itself the interpersonal covenant of man and woman, and it realizes the covenant that is born from love and welcomed by both parties as a marriage, and recognized as such by society. This sort of covenant between two persons is the foundation of the union by which the man unites with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. In the context mentioned above, one can say that this bodily unity is their right, bilateral. Above all, that is the regular sign of the communion of persons, of the unity brought about between the man and the woman, as much as they are spouses. Adultery committed by either of them is not only the violation of this right, which belongs exclusively to the other spouse, but at the same time a radical falsification of the sign. It seems that the oracles of the prophets express precisely this aspect of adultery with sufficient clarity. Of a right which belongs to each spouse, in other words, the right of the other person's person committed to each other. In other words, they have a right of monogamy, a monogamous relationship, but also it's a falsification of the sign. And what is that sign? The sign is of the relationship of God to Israel, God to his people. So now we start to move from, as you can see, the Bible itself, the Old Testament itself, is moving from legalism towards ethos, towards the meaning of the relation of man and woman, not just property rights or what would be good for the society, laws that govern society. I mean, that's all well and good, that's part of it, but now it becomes more, what is this relationship of man and woman? Aside from the law, what is this? This is something that echoes the relationship of God to Israel. And so covenant, in other words, faithfulness, is at the heart of it. This is a relationship that must be faithful because God's relationship to us, his covenant, is based on faithfulness.
Is he showing us likewise the relationship between the Trinity?
Yeah. Exactly. This is how he's going to eventually, it evolves. That's really what the spousal mystery is based. Spousal mystery is based on two images. If you can have two images that both have to do with God, that's how you answer the big why behind marriage, and why we desire it, and the ethos of it, and the faithfulness. It is a image of the very interior life of the Trinity, a participation in the interior life of the Trinity, because it's a union community of persons. More than one becomes one. And secondly, of the spousal relationship, the way that God related to us. Those are your two images. From those two images, both having to do with God, the God that we believe in. This is why it is so critical to understand God is three persons. And God is incarnational. So that's what separates us from Muslims, the Jews, everyone.
And the Manichaeans.
Yeah, especially the Manichaeans, yeah. Is that God is communion and he is incarnational. That's the key. That's why we're different. Our faith is different than all the rest. And that's why we're right. Maybe a better way to say it is complete. We have the most complete view. Because what happens is, if you take this view of the human person as rooted in this image of God, as community of persons and the incarnational, now you develop an ethos from that, and what will you end up with? You'll end up with what is most compassionate, most honest, most just. If you start from an understanding of God that is not communal and is not incarnational, then what do you end up with? You end up with systems that are going to be, in varying degrees, less or not as compassionate, as integrated, as just. See, this is why my goal in life is world domination of our religion. Because that's the best thing for the world. Simple as that. Do you understand?
Yeah, follow.
You can take any religion, take Hindu, take Muslim, and unpack them, like telescope them out. Okay, this is your concept of God. Now telescope out from that. Show me how that's going to design now a society for me. Out of that, design laws for me. Design morality for me. And what will you end up with?
Yeah, it follows, because in the sense the Muslims do the same thing. The whole idea of father is the national to them.
Yes,
God is the father.
exactly. And if that is, then what model do we have now for fatherhood? We don't have an adequate one. We have one that would be built on weak and shifting sand, as God, as the Lord would say. See, all of our models are rock solid because they are rooted in these two images. Any model that's not is going to eventually break down. It's going to have major weakness.
That'll be the flaw.
Huh?
That will be the flaw.
Yeah, it'll be flawed. And this is why you have in Muslim society things like, seeing women as property or oppressing them,
You still have slavery.
and you have the, huh?
You still have slavery based on the
Yeah,
whole idea.
exactly. This is why you have these things. Because they grow out of an ethos that's based on a God concept. So that's why whenever I talk about theology of the body, I always start with this concept of God, with these two images. Union community of persons, in love, that moves out from himself and unites himself intimately, spousally, with his creation. Those two things determine everything.
Does Judaism look at it the same way then?
No, not quite. It doesn't see God as Trinity,
Oh, yeah.
and it doesn't see, even when their concept of Messiah.
It's more political than it is.
Yeah, it's not going to be. It's not based on God incarnating himself. It's the Messiah, the Lord, as independent being coming, and so they're close. Obviously, there are we like the telescope. That was the beginning of the telescope. Was
Yeah.
Judaism for us, but we telescoped out of that based on eventually an evolving understanding of who this Trinitarian God is and what this God did. So the incarnation is so important. That's why Christmas is such a big deal, not because it's a holiday and all this nonsense. We shouldn't even call it Christmas, just call it like in my church we call it the
Incarnation.
incarnation, or the divine condescension. Yeah, we do.
Ooh.
Call it the divine condescension. Yeah, we say that God condescended. He bent down. This awesome holy God bends down, dares to lower himself, to become his own creature while remaining God. It's the marvelous condescension. That's the theme that's woven through prayers, that's the great, awesome miracle is that God would humiliate himself to that extent. That, that he truly became us. We're the only faith that believes that way. No other faith has the incarnational spirituality that thoroughly, that integrated.
Are you saying that most heresies then are all based on some interpretation of the incarnation?
Exactly. You just hit on one of my favorite points, my major fundamental message to the world. And everything boils down to this. There's only one thing you really have to know. An invisible God has become visible through the physical. That is the only story that there is. There's no other story. And everything is either a revelation or participation of that one thing. Or, I should say, it's a denial or a dilution of it. And it's exactly what Christian heresies are. Christian heresies are all about, in one way or another, a confusion about the reality of the incarnation. In other words, they hedge on it some way, or they short circuit it. That's what all Christian heresy is about. Because the fact is that this incarnational event was complete, meaning he was completely human, except without sin, and completely God, all at the same time. One did not overshadow the other. He wasn't two persons. He was one person, but totally human. But in being human, in infusing himself into humanity, he infuses himself into all creation. All creation. And this is why the thing that I like is to sum it all up, what we're saying here. I call it, going back to school, which is what John Paul II did. Sacramental, Catholic, so these terms are all equated. Catholic, human, they all mean the same thing. Liturgical, worldview, school, SCHL. Sacramental, Catholic, human, liturgical worldview. In other words, the sacramental means we see God in everything. I mean, we actually see his presence in everything, in the whole created order.
Well, you have to be careful with this, not to run into pantheism.
Well, we don't equate him with it, we just see his presence there.
Okay.
And because of that, we respond liturgically by offering back in thanksgiving. And to do that is to be fully Catholic and fully human. To be human is to be Catholic. These two words are exactly the same. To be Catholic means to be human. Catholic is not a religion. Even though we call it that, it's not a religion. Catholic is simply the truth about being human.
As opposed to universal?
Well, the technical word means universal, but the faith, the Catholic faith, is not a religion. I mean, I'm saying this,
I understand.
but
Okay.
we call it a religion, but it's not. It's not religion. Okay, yeah, it is, but that's sort of shortchanging it.
Okay.
Catholic simply means living this way. And what's the proof of that? What's the source and summit of our existence?
Eucharist.
Eucharist. And what is the Eucharist?
Jesus.
It's the
God.
ultimate of the invisible made visible through the physical. Right? It's the ultimate. And what do we do with that? We do it in the context of liturgy. We, in the Eucharist, the Eucharist is the gathering up of all creation, including, the apex of which, of course, is ourselves and our Lord, and offering that back to God in sacrifice. That's why they even use the words, what human hands have made, things from the earth, made by God, but then with our hands too, co-creating with God, and all that's offered back to God. So, and see, this sacramental worldview is the correct view of the human person. And what he's saying in here, especially when you get towards the end, when he starts getting into about how, it's one of my favorite parts, about the language of liturgy is conjugal, and conjugal relations are liturgical. He completely equates the ultimate human expression of love with liturgy, and vice versa. But it's not John Paul doing it. Remember, John Paul II, what he did was, he wasn't original, in a good way. He'd be the first to say that. He was and he wasn't. And I mean it in a good way. That's a compliment.
He's a good plagiarist.
He wasn't original in the sense that all he did was go back into the soul, the heart of the church, of what Catholic really is, what human really is. What is original with him is how he put it together. The framework, the structure that we now know as the theology of the body. His thought, his way of transmitting it, of organizing it. But he didn't just come up with this like it's a novel thing in his part. I know for a lot of theology body, I'm probably one of the few theology body people that says this, but if you think about it, it's true. The theology body is not new. It's looking at the oldest things in new ways. And John Paul will be the first to admit that, because where did he go? There's over 1,400 sightings from Scripture between the pages of this book. 1,400. So he went into Scripture, it went into the mystics, the liturgy of the church, the human experience, and he also threw in science. So he went back and dug into this stuff that was forgotten and covered over. And he uncovered it, he dug it out, brought it back, and refashioned it, and shot it to us. That's the theology of the body.
Like what Aquinas did with Aristotle?
Yeah, exactly. So, in one sense, it's not original, and that's the greatest compliment you can give to it. Meaning, it is the fundamental truth from time immemorial. It's just that he packaged it so that you and I could sort of understand it.
And for this ethos package, is that not the idea of Catholic? And human
Yeah.
would be the structure of the ethos?
Yes, the ethos. The Catholic ethos is what? Catholic ethos is God has infused himself into his own creation, which means all creation is holy. All creation reveals God. Through creation, we can touch God. Creation is not equal to God. It's just how he reveals himself. And what's the height or the apex of creation? The human person, right? This is why I said the theology of the body is the answer to all of life's questions. Because the human, whatever we're saying about the human person, we're saying about all of creation. All of creation. In other words, what we're doing is we are looking at things as they really are and listening to them as they tell us who they are through the language of their bodies. For us, it's the human body, but it's also the body of anything. A blade of grass, a flower, a star, an asteroid. Anything that has matter to it speaks. There's a language to it. It says what it is. Water tells us what it is, right? Does it not? And if we listen to that language and we interface with the water according to what it tells us about itself, then good things will happen. If we don't listen to water and we interface with it in a way that's not honest to what it is, then bad things will happen. What's a bad thing that will happen?
Drown.
Huh?
Drown.
Drowning, floods, pollution, right? Yes.
You mentioned earlier that part of Christ's mission was to point us back towards the way things were in the beginning, but even more so to sort of lead us towards our ultimate fulfillment, our ultimate destiny. If let's see, how can I say this? If sort of our ultimate destiny is life with God in heaven,
Mm-hmm.
we hear that there's no marriage in heaven, so we live in this celibate state, and we hear that celibate people who are living the consecrated life are living that like eschatological witness.
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem that state of life is sort of our ultimate destiny, our ultimate way of sort of being in like relationship to God. But God told Adam and Eve, to be fruitful and multiply and all that, and like that happened before the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So why would God have not wanted them to remain celibate and sort of live in that state of like ultimate relationship with God? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. It's because he wanted very simple, on the very simple level, God wanted as many people as possible living with him eventually as one. He wanted as many persons as possible in heaven. That's why he wants us to be fruitful. He wants his banquet table filled. And being fruitful is a way of, it's a foreshadowing of the ultimate in heaven. That's why God encourages it. He wants us to put it in basic language. He wants us to have sexual relations. He wants us to do that. He wants us to procreate. Because it's our little snatch of heaven on earth. That's why people like it. It's how it's designed. So he wants to continue to be fruitful, multiply, and from Adam and Eve on, because it's how we experience a taste of things heaven.
And isn't heaven about union? It's not really
Yes.
about celibacy, like just being alone. It's really about more union than we've ever known.
Right.
And
Exactly.
with each other and with God and everything.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example of way to put it precisely, sister. That's in the Western church for marriage, they say, till death do you part, right? In the Eastern church, you know what we say? Till death unites you forever. Now, both sound like they're saying the opposite things. They're actually arriving at the same point, but coming at it from two different ways. The point is, there is celibacy in heaven, but not as we think of it now. So there's no marriage in heaven as it is here.
But it's because everyone's united in heaven?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the marriage of the Lamb.
Right, it's the marriage of the Lamb.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are all one. We all become one.
It better be, because
Right.
I've staked my life on it. No.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Yeah, that's like
Please say it, please say it.
when I talk with teenagers, I love to tell them, you know what John Paul II said that heaven's going to be like? Perpetual virginity. It is, but you have to understand what he means by that. He means total oneness, intactness. In fact, when two people, when a husband and wife enter into marital relations, the one flesh union, just like the word said, the one flesh union, they become virginal. Yeah, the goal of the one flesh union is virginity. Meaning what? Oneness, intactness.
That's why when you look with even with your wife for lust, you're violating your virginity.
Yeah.
Or your virginity with her.
Yes.
Okay, I see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the goal of intercourse is oneness, is union, which is virginity. You're virginal you have to think more comprehensive about the word virgin. Think like a Catholic now. Catholics, we're supposed to think integrated, mystical. In other words, the ultimate meaning of something, not compartmental. Okay, so let's finish up a little section for tonight. Okay, I think I'll continue with number 4 at the bottom, 276. What is emphasized in the legislative text is the violation of property rights, and in the first place, of the husband's property right to the woman, who, though she is his legal wife, is one among many. In the text of the prophets, the background of effective and legalized polygamy does not change the ethical meaning of adultery. In many texts, monogamy seems to be the only right analogy of monotheism, understood in the categories of the covenant, that is, of the faithfulness and trust in the only true God Yahweh, Israel's bridegroom. Adultery is the antithesis of this spousal relation and the opposite of marriage, also as an institution. Inasmuch as monogamous marriage actualizes in itself in a personal covenant of man and woman, and it realizes the covenant that is born from love and welcomed by both parties as a marriage. A little bit further down. In the context mentioned above, one can say that this bodily unity is their right, but above all, that is the regular sign of the communion of persons. Okay, we read that, sorry. Okay. Okay, we begin at the bottom of page 277. In italics, which means John Paul wanted us to know this. Anything in italics is what he wanted to emphasize. One can judge about adultery, about its sinfulness, about the moral evil it contains, on the basis of the principle of antithesis to the conjugal covenant understood in this way. We must all keep all this in mind when we say that adultery is a sin of the body. The body is here considered in the conceptual connection with the words of Genesis that speak in fact about the man and the woman who unite so intimately with each other that they form one flesh. Adultery indicates the act by which a man and a woman who are not husband and wife form one flesh. That is, those who are not husband and wife in the sense of the monogamy established at the beginning, rather than the sense of the legal casuistry of the Old Testament. The sin of the body can be identified only in reference to the relationship between the persons. One can speak of moral good and evil according to whether this relationship makes such a unity of the body true and whether or not it gives to that unity the character of a truthful sign. In this case, therefore, we can judge adultery as a sin in conformity with the act's objective content. And this is the content Christ had in mind when he recalls the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it, that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Yet Christ does not dwell on this aspect of the problem. Now, this was significant, these last couple sentences, because this gives you the crux. I'm going to use the word, to sum up these sentences, I'm going to use the word honesty. It's all about honesty. This is the whole, I call it the H zone. It's just an easy way to understand it, I think. This is what he's saying. What he just said there was how to understand all of Catholic morality. I call it entering the H zone, which is the honesty zone. H, if we're honest with the language of the body, because like he's saying here that adultery is sinning with the body, but because of the sign of what the body's doing. That's sign, in other words, the spousing the body says, I belong to you, period, and you to me. So if I unite my body with someone who I don't belong to, then my body is lying. And here's how it works. If we're honest with the language of the body, we will be holy. That's what holiness is. Holiness is the only ticket to happiness, another H word. And of course, if you do all this, you get the big H, right? Heaven. Now conversely, as the young people would say, if you dishonesty, you get another big H called hurt. And if you dishonesty and hurt enough, you get the other big H. So the only thing all you have to know, you're going to walk out of here being, you should all get PhDs in moral theology, and all you have to know is one word: honesty. Something is right or wrong based on whether it's honest with the language. Is the language of the body telling the truth or telling a lie? And the reason why it's wrong, because if it's a lie, a dishonesty, there's going to be hurt. See, that's the key. That's what makes something wrong. So what you do is, I give this to the teenagers as a handy little, I call it the hip pocket principle. When they want to know, like, how far do we go on a date? I tell them, well, take out your hip pocket principle. Ask yourself, what are you and she doing, or she and he doing with your bodies? What is it saying? Is it honest to the situation? If it's not, then you're hurting each other, and therefore it's wrong. If it is honest, then you're not hurting each other. It's good. Do it. Simple as that. And that's what's behind, how we articulate what's wrong with same-sex union and contraception, all the big hot-button issues, all boil down to one thing. What you're doing with the body is speaking a dishonesty, and that will hurt. And the church doesn't want you to hurt, nor does God. And this is what John Paul is saying right there in that passage about what makes adultery wrong in terms of the body. Because the body is a sign, it's expressing something. In that action, in the action of two bodies being united, say, we are united. We are to each other. That's it. Now, if you say, I'm with you, but I'm also with you, then you have a lie. Now, we saw what happened between Sarah and Hagar. There was a lot of tension, wasn't there? Because there was a dishonesty there. We're hardwired, even though the Old Testament, like he said here tonight, even though they overlaid this allowance for polygamy, it wasn't a happy situation, because we're not by nature hardwired for that. We're hardwired for monogamy. You can only give, because the act of union, one flesh union, is an act of total giving, right? Well, you can only give yourself to one person. You got nothing left once you've given it, right? It's not like you've got all these bodies. You've got one body. You give it to this one person, you're done. So polygamy is like a fantasy. It's like a lie. It's a lie. It's just you know what I mean? You can't give, and then if you try, there's all kinds of problems. Because each one believes then they all want to feel like they're the number one. Okay. On page 279, we're almost done here. 279, the second paragraph. We must ask ourselves, why has the center of gravity of sin shifted? Further, what is the authentic meaning of the analogy? If according to its basic meaning, adultery can in fact only be a sin committed in the body, in what sense does what man commits in his heart also deserve to be called adultery? The words with which Christ lays the foundation of new ethos need to be, on their part, deeply rooted in anthropology. Before we respond to these questions, we will dwell a little on the expression in Matthew 25, 27, 28 that makes, in some sense, a transfer or shift of the meaning of adultery from the body to the heart. It consists of words about desire. In the bottom of the page. We are concerned here not only with the psychological interpretation, but at the same time with the theological interpretation. Christ speaks in the context of human experience, at the same time in the context of the work of salvation. These two contexts, in some way, superimpose themselves on each other and interpenetrate. And this has an essential and constitutive meaning for the whole ethos of the gospel, and particularly for the content of the verb to desire, or to look to desire. Now, we're going to end here just the last 2 pages. Let's see. Because he goes into what eventually is going to be a very, very big topic. One of my favorites. It has to do with this whole ethos of looking. How do we, in fact, I'm doing I should have brought the flyers here. December 13th, I'm doing a men's day, a day of recollection for men on the whole topic of lust, desire, seeing, how to see. How to see, how men are to look at women. In fact, the title of the day is called Anatomy of a Woman. If you're interested, just go to taborlife.org. Get the information. But this is crucial. This is a very, very big part of this whole theology of the body, is that how do we see? The ethos of seeing. So we'll just start to begin it here on the bottom of 280. The wisdom tradition. The wisdom tradition, as we know, had a particular interest in the ethics and the morals of Israelite society. In these warnings and counsels found, for example, in Proverbs and so on, what strikes us immediately is a certain one-sidedness, inasmuch as the warnings are above all directed toward men. This could mean that warnings are particularly necessary for them. As for the woman, it is true that in these warnings and counsels she appears more often as an occasion of sin or as a downright seducer of whom to be aware. Nevertheless, one should recognize that in addition to warning men to be on guard against women and seduction of their charm, which pulls men towards sin, Proverbs and Sirach also deliver eulogies about the woman who is a perfect companion for her husband. And they likewise sing the praises of the beauty and charm of a good wife who knows how to make her husband happy. A modest wife adds charm to charm, and no balance can weigh the value of a chaste soul. Like the sun rising in the heights of the Lord, so the beauty of a good wife adorns her house. Like the shining lamp on the holy lampstand, so is a beautiful face and a noble figure. Like golden pillars on silver bases, so are graceful legs and steadfast feet. A wife's grace delights her husband, and her knowledge strengthens his bones. Down at the bottom of the page, number 6, towards the last couple sentences. Just as in the virtue of the prophetic tradition, the audience was in some sense prepared for understanding the concept of adultery correctly. So in virtue of the wisdom tradition, it was prepared for understanding the words about the concupiscent look, or adultery in the heart. He's talking about the people to whom Christ was speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, that they were ready to understand what he was about to tell them. Let's see. Okay, on page 285. And we'll go to 285, 286, and we'll end there for today. This is the second paragraph in 285. We must now offer such an analysis. The look expresses what is in the heart. The look, I would say, expresses man as a whole. If one assumes in general that man acts in conformity with what he is, operation follows being. In the present case, Christ wants to show that man looks in conformity with what he is. Looking follows being. Through the look, man shows himself on the outside and to others. Above all, he shows what he perceives in his interior. Christ teaches us thus to see the look as a threshold, as it were, the interior truth. Already in the look, in the way one looks, it is possible to grasp fully that concupiscence is. Let's try to explain it. Lustful, desiring, looking to desire, indicates an experience of the value of the body in which its spousal meaning ceases to be spousal, precisely because of concupiscence. What also ceases is its procreative meaning. We spoke about this meaning above. Which, when it concerns the conjugal union of man and woman, is rooted in the spousal meaning of the body and comes forth organically, as it were, from it. So when man desires and looks to desire, he experiences more or less explicitly the detachment from that meaning of the body, which, as we have already observed in our reflection, stands at the basis of the communion of persons, both outside of marriage and in a particular way when man and woman are called to build a union in the body. And the last point, next paragraph, halfway down. Does he not mean to say thereby that precisely concupiscence, like adultery, is an inner detachment from the spousal meaning of the body? Does he not want to refer his listeners to their inner experiences of such a detachment? Is it not for this reason that he defines it as adultery committed in the heart? It's interesting. He says, an inner detachment from the spousal meaning of the body. See, the body, this is where you can understand when he goes into, especially love responsibility, and also in here, the section on art, when he talks about the naked human body, and looking at the naked human body, representations of it, such as the Sistine Chapel and so on, where he says that purity, in fact, I'll read the quote. I always love asking teenagers, what do you think the Pope would consider purity? And this always blows their mind. Here's the quote. Purity is the glory of the human body before God. It is the glory of God in the human body through which masculinity and femininity are manifested. From purity springs that singular beauty that permeates every sphere of reciprocal common life between human beings and allows them to express in it the simplicity and depth, the cordiality and repeatable authenticity of personal trust. Okay, so purity is the glory of the human body. So, seeing, and this is where we get into his whole presentation on art and using the human body in art, what's legitimate. I use this a lot. It's very, very helpful in terms of pornography and soft porn, how it works, what's wrong with it, why is it wrong. It all comes down to do you see the person and the spousal dimension of the person revealed in the body? Or are you detached from that and you just see the body as something for procreation? And he's very explicit about this. He says that it is not the human body, the naked body, that is wrong. It is how it is seen and how it is presented. If it's presented as detached from revealing the person and the spousal meaning of the person, then it's wrong. Yes?
What are like practical steps that you can take towards trying to cultivate that habit of, you know, looking at somebody and seeing the entire person, not just, you know, the way they are physically, or not just those, you know, external aspects. Like I'd heard stories from people who met John Paul II. They said, you know, when he looked at you, then it seemed like, you know, you were the only person in the entire room.
Right.
And he sort of, you know, it's like the way that he looked at somebody, he saw the whole person.
Right.
And sort of gave himself to that
Mhm.
person. I mean, how do we go about, you know, taking practical steps towards looking at people in that same way?
Well, it's part of a.
It's probably might be another discussion, but.
Yeah, of course I do, and I do a lot of that kind of work with, mostly because I come from an art background, so it kind of gives a little advantage there. The couple ways, real practically, is to learn how to see that way on lesser things, things of nature, human things, man-made things. In other words, it's well, he uses the term, the piece of interior gaze, but another way of looking at it is kind of like a contemplative gaze, contemplative look. In other words, where you practice seeing something as it really is. Its integrity, its design, its principles of beauty, of balance, of design. You do it with nature, do it with even human things, man-made things. And then learn to do that all the time, and then you apply it then to the human person. And you always try to make the person out to be a person. Sometimes you need to like especially especially where I work with the guys in this, I tell them, like, you know, we're a very pornified culture. We're a totally pornified culture. That's why one of the reasons we're so messed up sexually, because we're just surrounded. We're like living in a sewer. You know, if you live in a sewer, you can't help but end up smelling, right? Okay, so we all smell a bit because we live in a sewer, a sexual sewer. It's all around us. So what you do then, and what's the essence of that? The essence of that is the objectification of the person. It's a depersonalization. What you do then is personalize what you see. You can't avoid seeing it. So what you do is, let's take like say a billboard. They usually use a woman's body in an objective way to sell something, a product, you know, oftentimes. You see that. What you do is, you just don't see that and see the body. You personalize it. You actually make up a story. You give the person a name. Make them a real person in your mind. You make up a little story about them. What do you imagine them to be? You know, gee, maybe she's a single mother. Probably had to do this lousy job with this perverted photographer because she has a kid, probably a husband who ran out on her. You know, whatever. You start to make her a person. And you can do this instantaneously. And then you do what I call see, pray, and pass on. You see something, it's beautiful, it's okay, see it as beautiful. Let that inspire prayer in you. You know, praise God for such beauty. And then move on. Think of other things. Then look at other things. Focus on other things. Other things that are beautiful too. It's a practice, it's like a habit you do, and you learn to do it, and pretty soon it starts to become, you know, again, your ethos, you know. When I came back from one of these classes, last time when I was driving back, I think it was from this one, I turned down No, it was something else I was at. I'm sorry, I was coming from something else, and I turned out, I think it was Jackson Street. And there was this advertisement on I think it was on a bus stop. It was like, kind of like a billboard thing, you know, like a big poster. And it was, I wish I had a picture of it, because it was such a good example. I forget what it was for. It was advertising something, but it was, might still be around, maybe you've seen it. It was the back of a woman, you know, she was nude, but she had like you can tell she had like a little, some kind of a robe or something still on her, in her front. And it was very, very artistically done, very, very eye-catching, and very, I thought very, very artistic, very beautiful. And someone might look at that and go, oh, well, that's, you know, they're selling sex or whatever, but when you look at things through the theology of the body, you know, you learn to see beauty for its own sake, and not to look at it and see it as something else, something different. And it starts to become kind of natural as you practice it. But that was a good example. That was a very, I thought, a very beautiful ad, even though it was using the human body, a woman's human body, nude, but in a very, I thought, tasteful way, in a very artistic way. It's something you would see very commonly in Europe. Why in Europe? Why do you think in Europe? Catholic country. They have much better ethos of the human body. They use the human body in, you know, sculptures everywhere, nudity, well, the Sistine Chapel, you know, in ways that are not porn, or even soft porn. This was not soft porn. This was very artistic. It was like a classical painting almost, but it was a photograph of a woman. It's the kind of imagery that would be very good for our culture to learn to look at and to see, to help us see the human body nude or partial or whatever, but presented in a way that's not provocative but still beautiful. And then you learn to see it that way, and then it's the best thing for combating lust. See, it's time to quit now, but the message here is, when it comes to that, is not looking away as much, that's part of it, as it is looking at, but with the eyes of God, seeing things correctly. And it's just a discipline you learn, you know, and you keep, you know, you do it habitually, and then it starts to become more natural. It's kind of a spirituality of wonderment. That's why Jesus said, unless you be like little children, you won't gain heaven. Because what's one of the hallmarks of little children? They're a perpetual wonderment. They're always amazed at everything. They always say, wow, look at that, you know. G.K. Chesterton is really great on this, you know. Yeah, where he talks about that, the wonderment of children, that's that mystical worldview, that contemplative, sacramental worldview, where you see beauty and you marvel at it, and it makes you pray. Instead of lust, it makes you pray. That's the point you want to come to, you know. And that's the way. That's how we'll be able to combat pornography. You know, it's like, do you know how they train people in Washington to in D.C. you know to detect counterfeit money? They never show them counterfeit money. They only show them the real thing. And they come to see and know the real thing so well that the counterfeit will hit them in the face. And that's the same thing with this. That's what this is saying. Look at the real thing and come to really see it, so that you don't even want the false thing. If men could see the way this is teaching us to see, we would not have a problem with pornography. This will single-handedly dismantle the entire porn industry. And that's one of the things I'm personally committed to. Which means I'll probably end up with a bullet in my back. Because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. But that's what'll do it. You simply will not have an appetite for it once you learn to see the real thing.
Any homework for next time?
Oh yeah, we're gonna. Oh yeah, Sister asked me. I think we can maybe. You think 4 more sessions? Would that be all right?
Well, I mean, we would like to go on perpetually, right?
Yeah.
But whatever you think.
Yeah, because I'm thinking since it's once a month, that'll take us into April. You know.
Okay.
and-
And then we'll
Is that
start all
okay?
over again.
Yeah,
This is-
so
this is
okay,
someone
yeah,
suggested.
good class, yeah.
Then we do the introduction, because the introduction is so wonderful.
Yeah.
It's really good. Now that you know what the book is.
Yeah, the introduction is just
It's fabulous.
so good. It's really,
That was what Michael Waldstein wrote, or?
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
You wrote that.
I do a lot of talking just on the introduction, which is really essential. It's just so well done.
He gives the whole background of how John Paul II got to theology of body, too, like,
Yeah.
where did he get it all from? And,
Yeah,
you
see
know,
it, kind of like why he did it, because he was answering really what has been, you know those veils I talked about? Well, we've been living under this veil for 500 years. Believe it or not. We don't, especially in the Western world, we don't actually see life as Catholics, even if you are Catholic. The people with the best chance of that are people who were born in Europe, born and raised in Europe, because it's a Catholic ethos, so surrounded by it. And the reason is because in the 16th century, to make it in a nutshell real quick, the 16th century, we entered the scientific era, and what happened was there was a shift in our worldview, which is basically a repeat of things like Manichaeism and all that, where basically the created matter, the physical became devalued because we could dominate it now. So the point of the physical world now is to dominate it, and do whatever you want with it. It has no value, see. It got separated from the spiritual. And that's how we see life. That's why we pollute. That's why we use things. We use people. We litter. We are careless, because it's all about the physical not having no value. It's all about the rational. And that gave rise to all the things that have been threats to civilization since then. I call it the isms: communism, Nazism, fascism, materialism. And John Paul II was answering that worldview. He was saying, no, that's the wrong worldview. I'm going to show you the correct worldview, the one that puts the physical and the spiritual back together. Translated, the Catholic sacramental worldview. Because once you do that, then you see the body then is holy and sacred. You can't just do anything you want with it. You can't do anything you want with the environment. You can't do anything you want with the created world, physical matter. Okay, thank you. See you next month then. Yeah, so, yeah, we'll read, we'll have 4 more sessions, so we'll just keep reading.
Page 285 on?
Yeah, from 286, number 40, start with number 40.